Anyone who has been in the online historical sphere for long enough has no doubt seen plenty of propaganda about the war for Confederate independence, usually on the pro-Union side of things. And in the rare event you do see pro-Confederate narratives, they're typically lost cause or garbage, oftentimes just as or even more inaccurate than the Yankee myths that are so often perpetuated. So, in this video, I have decided to debunk 10 of the most common myths from both sides here, although most of them are from the northern side. Number 10. Secession was illegal. This claim is made a lot by the Unionist side of the argument. The gist of their basic points are that secession is illegal, the Confederacy seceded, therefore the U.S. was right to restore order to what they would label as an act of rebellion. But, unfortunately for them, it has little basis in reality. The main source for this argument is a Supreme Court decision of Texas v. White. Long story short, the Texan government prior to secession had received some treasury bonds as part of the Compromise of 1850, which is a whole other can of worms we don't have time to get into. After Texas had seceded and joined the Confederate States of America, it had needed some cash and so sold them to the public. After the war, the military government sought to get those back. The holders of the bonds refused, and so there was a lawsuit. The Supreme Court sided with the occupation, using it as an example case to retroactively prohibit secession. Let's not lose sight of this. The entire decision was transparently about protecting the Union's legally questionable actions up to that point. Bottom line, this case means nothing. It's a biased decision made implicitly to back up the war and subsequent occupation. If we do the sensible thing and disregard Texas v. White, then that leaves us with only the Constitution, which says absolutely nothing about secession, one way or the other. That means secession falls in a gray area, and one could argue outright legal by default. The whole issue is complicated, but to claim secession as outright illegal is nonsense. Number 9. The Confederates were traitors. This is another claim often pushed that's in a similar vein to the last. Whereas secession is pretty ambiguous, this claim is not. Treason is defined in the Constitution as, quote, levying war against them or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort, end quote. The Union sympathizers in the audience will point to the line about waging war against the U.S. as the part the Confederates violated. But of course, that only applies to Americans. This is where secession's ambiguity comes back into play. If secession is illegal, then the Confederates could be culpable. However, if secession is legal, then of course the Confederates were not Americans, and so they are not traitors. Like I said, the secession thing is ambiguous. But for a union where member states only lose the rights they sign away to the federal government, and the member states never explicitly signed away their right to secession, then I would say secession is legal, and therefore the Confederates were not Americans. Reasonable people disagree, but treason is just impossible under the circumstances. For those who do disagree, I would advise you to read up on the prosecution of Jefferson Davis. Here is an example of where the literal Confederate president was put on trial for treason. And the prosecution failed so badly that the trial never even happened. In fact, the Supreme Court Justice Salmon P. Chase even went so far as to say, quote, if you bring these leaders to trial, it will condemn the North, for by the Constitution, secession is not rebellion. His capture was a mistake. His trial will be a far greater one. We cannot convict him of treason. Ultimately, the trial never materialized. Number 8. The CSA would have conquered the USA. This is one which ain't explicitly stated, but often implied, especially when talking about Gettysburg, John Hunt Morgan, or Early's raid on D.C. If you think about it for more than 2 seconds, it makes no sense. The Confederacy was fighting to be free of the North. Why would they ever conquer it? And besides, the task itself would be impossible. But you still get people subtly implying that the Confederacy was an Avengers-level threat, which would just up and destroy America. I guess people just like living in a fantasy world where every enemy is a reskinned King George or Adolf Hitler. Number 7. Grant was a military genius. This one is fairly forgivable, as it could come from a place of ignorance. It's easy to see a general who won a war that spanned half a continent as a genius. But he really wasn't. I don't mean to say that Grant was incompetent. He was a good general, but that's all he was. If you look at his campaigns, none are all that impressive. He was fighting a weaker enemy while having far superior supplies and manpower than said enemy, oftentimes in terrain that was much more favorable to attacking and outmaneuvering his opponents. Typically, The odds were in his favor, and he would win. Sometimes they weren't, and he would usually lose. The only time he faced real difficulty and came out on top was at Vicksburg, which was a long, drawn-out siege and relied more on time and numbers than brilliant generalship. But some Yankees just can't help but suck him off at each and every opportunity. Granted, Confederate enthusiasts tend to say the same sort of stuff about Lee, which brings us to number 6. Lee was a military genius. As much as I would love to sit here and tell you how Lee was the best general to ever live and was like Aurelian reincarnated, I can't. He, just like Grant, was a good general, but not some infallible genius like so many people say. He was dealt a bad hand, militarily speaking, and sought to gamble it all on a big Napoleonic battle where the Yankees would finally be crushed. In other words, basically the worst possible call. He was also a bit of a boomer, and failed to adapt to the changing face of warfare quickly enough, which is why he okayed things like Pickett's Charge, and why he thought forts would still be impregnable fortresses like they were 50 years before. Bottom line, both Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee were very good generals, but not geniuses. If you want a masterfully led campaign in this war, you can go look at Stonewall Jackson's Valley Campaign. Number 5. Britain and France would have helped the Confederacy. This one honestly may be more of a misconception than true myth, but it still warrants a mention, as it can be twisted to suit either side. If you assume that it's true, which it really isn't, then it begs the question, why? The pro-Confederate version would be the idea that the Europeans saw how awful and tyrannical the North's actions were, and would help out due to a moral obligation. The pro-Union version would be that the European powers saw the conflict as a way to weaken the US and bring about a new wave of colonialism. Both are totally false, and as a result, are actually the least commonly stated myths on this list. A more common version is that the British and French would have helped the Confederacy in order to secure favorable trading arrangements in regards to Confederate cotton and tobacco exports. This is more basis in reality, as both powers imported lots of southern cash crops. Cotton textiles had actually been what kick-started the Industrial Revolution in Britain. But to say that the UK or France would actually go to war over it is a major stretch. The most they would have done is diplomatically pressured the US into letting the South go. And even then, only if the Confederacy made them significant promises and looked like they were going to win. Because the last thing the Franks and Angles would do is bet on a losing horse and get nothing out of it. Number 4. The CSA would have restarted the slave trade. There is a kernel of truth here, in that there were some radical politicians who wanted to restart the transatlantic slave trade. But they were a vocal minority, akin to radical politicians in the modern day. After all, do you really see every policy of Bernie Sanders going mainstream in every state at any point in the near future? And he's a lot more mainstream than the aforementioned Confederate politicians were. If, for the sake of argument, they did bring the slave trade back, then there is a certain globe-spanning navy that would certainly take issue. Ultimately, it just wouldn't have happened. Number 3. Myths about African American soldiers. There are a few similar myths regarding black soldiers during the war, so I've just lumped them all together. Just keep in mind that these myths in particular have lots of variations, so while I've made many generalizations in this video, this entry will be heavy with sweeping generalizations about complex myths with many permutations regarding a complex topic. So put an asterisk by everything I'm about to say. I'm primarily concerned with 3 myths. There were no black Confederates, there were lots of black Confederates, and the overemphasis on Union-colored troops. The first 2 I'll debunk together. There were some black soldiers on the Confederate side, both free and otherwise, but they were the exception rather than the norm. There were quite a few, usually slaves but sometimes free blacks, who filled non-combat roles, such as constructing fortifications, hauling munitions, cooking, and various other jobs. There were very, very few that actually marched into battle and fought, but there were some. As for the third myth, what do I even mean by overemphasis on colored troops? Well, if you watch most any documentary, read any blog post, view any YouTube video on the subject, or really just view anything meant for non-history buffs, people with only a casual, surface-level interest in the topic at best, then you'll always hear about how there were so many blacks who went to join the US Army to do their part. Obviously, these soldiers existed and really did fight, but it's often treated like they were a huge factor in Union victory, and it really wasn't. I'm not trying to demean the sacrifices and bravery of these men, not at all, but in a tactical and strategic sense, they were no more or less important than any other unit. Number 2. Gettysburg was the turning point. Like number 5, this is a misconception rather than an outright myth. But lots of less informed people, the common notion is that the CSA began to lose after they lost the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a fitting climax of the first half of the war. And if you're making a dramatization about the conflict, then it's a very dramatic incident. And it's right to hold it in a certain place in American history, as the bloodiest battle or the bloodiest war that brought a definitive end to an entire campaign. But that's all it is. People often call it the turning point, but it really wasn't. It definitely hurt Lee's army, but in the grand scheme of things, it just returned the previous status quo of Union armies chasing Lee all over Virginia. The losses sustained probably brought the Army of Northern Virginia one step closer to defeat, but the war wasn't lost in the East. It was lost in the Western Theater, in Georgia and along the Mississippi. A much better quote-unquote turning point is the capture of Vicksburg, which really did spell doom for the CSA. And lastly, number 1. The war was because of slavery or states' rights. And here we have it. The two dumbest narratives in the history of historical revisionism. In one corner, we have the story of a rebellion that spontaneously began and attacked the northern states to protect slavery and only slavery. In the other corner is the story of an army which fought to defend the fundamental rights of the states against an army of freedom-hating NPCs. Both are false. I was going to lay out points made by both sides and debunk them, but instead I'm just going to tell you what happened. Prior to the war, the United States of America was divided politically, culturally, and economically in two halves, north and south, with a large expanse of frontier to the west, waiting to be settled. The South relied on growing cotton, which was purchased by the North, Britain, and France. As a result of how labor-intensive growing cotton is, the South relied on slave labor, which was illegal and strongly disliked in the North. Over time, a rift formed, and the slaveholding states and free states became bitterly opposed to one another. As the frontier was settled, each new state was fought over, sometimes literally, and the strain in the Congress due to this competition only grew. Eventually, the main political party in both halves of the Union, the Democratic Party, was sharply divided and ran too many candidates, allowing a small regional Northern party to seize power. With the Republican ascension, the South was completely cut out of politics. Soon, slavery would be abolished, destroying the South's economy and basically making them into a subordinate partner in the Union. But the North invaded and conquered them, bringing to pass what the Confederacy was created to avoid. So, yes, the South did secede for slavery, which is pretty darn immoral. But it can be very misleading if you don't have the context. The war for the Union was never about freeing the slave. It was about subjugating the South.